Bending bindings in many ways is similar to bending sides. You can bend them by hand on an iron or in a bending machine. However, bending bindings can be a skosh more difficult as you are working with smaller pieces of wood instead of a larger piece like a side. Today I'm going to show you how to bend bindings using a bending machine. I start by marking the waist of the guitar onto the bindings. Next, I tape the bindings together. This will keep the bindings from laying across each other in the bending machine. I like to put a piece of tape at each end of the bindings and one piece of tape on each side of the center line that I drew at the waist. Don't put too much tape, as you can actually melt it to your bindings and make it difficult to remove. I will be using the bending machine to bend the bindings, and the process is about the same as bending sides. I start by placing a piece of spring steel in the bending machine. Next, I lightly spritz the binding with water. The key word here is lightly, especially if you have a lot of ingrain or curl in your binding. Now I place the bindings into the bending machine, making sure that the waist I marked on the bindings is aligned with the waist of the bender. I then place another piece of spring steel on top of the bindings. Make sure that the bindings are not overlapping each other and that the waist is where it should be. The heat source that I will be using is a silicone heating blanket. It is now placed in the bending machine on top of the sandwich of spring steel and bindings. To keep track of my temperature, I will be using a small cooking thermometer. It is inserted between the heating blanket and the top piece of the spring steel. Next, I lower the crank until it just begins to apply pressure on the sandwich of spring steel, bindings, and heating blanket. The springs are now attached to the pieces that are used to actually bend the bindings. I am using a router speed control to dial in my temperature and a timer to make sure I don't make toast out of the bindings or burn my shop down. You may laugh, but it has been known to happen. Please be extremely careful when working with any heat source in your shop. One of the advantages of using the silicone heating blanket is that it gets hot very quickly. The disadvantage is that it gets hot very quickly, so you must pay attention to what you're doing. I like to turn off the radio and telephone so I have as few distractions as possible. Usually around 250 degrees Fahrenheit, I can begin turning the crank to begin bending the bindings at the waist. Go slow. There's no need to crank quickly here. Once the waist is bent, begin pulling the block with the springs attached. This will bend either the upper or lower bout. It doesn't matter which one you do first. You can pause for a couple of seconds halfway through the bend to make sure the area that is the greatest stress point is truly hot. Now bend the other bout in the same manner. Once again, you can pause briefly at the stress point if you like to guarantee that the area is truly hot. The whole process is done in just a few minutes and the temperature never reaches more than 350 degrees. Once the bindings are bent, I immediately turn off the temperature control and timer. It's also a good idea to unplug everything. Some builders like to let the bindings cool down and then put them through another heating cycle. Some even leave the bindings in the bending machine overnight. The idea here is to help prevent springback. Since I am usually in a production or classroom environment, I remove my bindings after just a few minutes. As you can see, there is little or no springback. Find a method that works for you and go with it. I bend bindings by hand on an iron the same way I bend sides on an iron. Reference my Luthier Tips du Jour video on side bending by hand if you'd like to see how it's done. Oh, and one other thing. I always make or order extra bindings because things don't always go as smoothly as I'm showing here.